Miami remains one of the most segregated cities in the country, even decades after sort of Jim Crow.
Welcome back to the Commons for Justice podcast, the show that aims to engage the community in crucial, complex, and sometimes controversial discussions about the past, present, and future of race, risk, and resilience in coastal communities. I'm your host, Genai Witter, and today we will be discussing the intricacies of community-based resilience with Dr. Kevin Grove. Dr. Grove is a political and cultural geographer, an associate professor at FIU, and also serves as one of the leads on the Commons for Justice grant's Neighborhood Storytelling and Arts component. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Dr. Grove.
Yeah, so I just want to jump right in about resilience and letting the good people know what it's all about. So, in your description of your book titled Resilience, you posed the question, is resilience simply a fad or is it a new way of thinking about human and environment relations and the governance of these relations that has real staying power? Or the option of resilience as dangerous, depoliticizing concept that neuters insipid political activity, or the key to more empowering, emancipatory, and participatory forms of environmental management. After having completed your research, which do you believe it is? Do you think that it's one or all, or how would you define resilience?
So I think one of the really interesting things about resilience is that it's a really underdetermined concept. So it is all of those at one and the same time. And I think this is what, kind of like the research that I've been doing in sites like Jamaica, New York City, Miami, and Puerto Rico, and some of the ongoing work that we've been doing within the Commons for Justice program. It's really kind of drawing out how resilience really kind of functions more or less as a way of thinking about the future. It's kind of a concept that orients our thought towards various forms of insecurity in the future. So that's the reason why resilience has become so popular, is that it's a new sort of almost an idiom, if you want to think of it in those terms, for governance nowadays, and what sort of social scientists and environmental humanities scholars and physical scientists call the Anthropocene, this new kind of geological era where humans are now drivers of planetary change. And those planetary changes are occurring at a scale and scope that are unpredictable. And so resilience then becomes a way of recalibrating and reconfiguring governance in response to the new kinds of pressures and dynamics within the Anthropocene.
I like that. That's a really all-encompassing definition. It's different for everybody, kind of.
But I think that, because resilience has become so influential, it's become something that all sorts of people, involved in various forms of struggle over local governance, urban governance, development politics, anti-colonial struggles, abolition struggles, people have to engage with resilience in some way, shape, or form or another. And so you get people who take up resilience in a variety of different and really kind of unexpected and surprising ways that, don't always fit with how ecological scientists would define resilience or how engineers would define resilience. But it's a way of kind of these folks engaging with local politics and the transformations in local politics that have been introduced by this new sort of overarching governance principle of resilience. It's very easy as a social scientist to sit back and sort of analyze the situation and just kind of speak from afar and say, resilience is bad. Resilience is like, all it does is like secure the status quo against, sort of shocks and disruptions. It's just another way to like ensure that nothing really changes. And it's very easy to sit back like that, but it's something very different when you begin to recognize that folks on the ground, like community organizers in New York and Miami, anti-colonial activists in Puerto Rico, these folks are doing stuff with resilience that doesn't fit either the model of local governance and the way that resilience has been adapted within local governance, or what you would find a lot of sort of critical analyses saying about resilience, the way that it maintains the status quo. So you find people who have far more experience and knowledge with local politics and political struggles than, any of us in the academy have. They're doing interesting stuff with resilience. And so the question becomes, how can we learn from them? So when I write on resilience, one of the things I'm always interested in writing on is not necessarily sort of trying to solve the problem of how we can do resilience better or solve the problem of how we can make our systems more secure, but rather kind of understanding how politics is changing within our current contemporary situation, and what can we learn from folks who are on the grounds, on the front lines of political struggles for more just futures.
Exactly. And I'm glad that you brought that point up because that's what we kind of want to segue into now. So, as a political geographer, essentially you focus on the ways that humans govern themselves in response to external stimuli. So, I really want to understand the why, the factor that's causing these crises. So, not the disasters themselves, but the biopolitical and social aspects of societies that may be impacting risk and resilience. So, by talking about your work in Puerto Rico and Jamaica, when you were talking about disaster resilience in Jamaica, you noted that each form of resilience in its own way leveraged everyday insecurities to recalibrate the political/economic dependencies and social and environmental exploitations that have shaped Caribbean political life since the plantation era, even as it created narrow possibilities to subserve forms of resistance. And I thought that that was such an amazing quote because I feel like it encapsulates how disaster management and response to certain risks can shape the way that people respond to that and can completely change the social dynamics within a system.
And this is the new form of colonialism. We still have the extraction of resources, precious metals coming in from Africa that make our cell phones and our communication technologies, our electric car batteries, everything like that, along with, sort of the direct exploitation of financial resources in the form of debt and debt interest that countries are saddled with. This is the new model of colonialism. This is colonialism without territorial control. It's the transfer of resources. You see the same pattern of the transfer of resources from countries throughout the global south to Europe and North America, just under a different kind of form of rule. That possibility, that potential for people subjected to these forms of control and domination to resist this, to reject it, and to seize their own potential for self-determination, to create their own worlds with their own forms of value. That's still there. And this is what gets revealed in moments of disaster, where people are forced to not rely on state agencies. They rely on themselves. They work together. Because resilience, as a model for sort of governing disaster management and development, sort of resilience assumes that vulnerable populations in places throughout the global south, rural Jamaica, rural Puerto Rico, for example, assumes that they do not have the capacities to respond to disasters, assumes that they, assumes that they are passive, that they lack the ability to sort of plan for and respond to disasters. And so it attempts then to sort of engage with communities and to say that, if you want to protect yourselves, if you want to ensure that you can weather the next storm, weather the next earthquake, the next hurricane, flooding, drought, whatever, you need to actually start following along with our sort of, you need to follow along with our sort of scientific programs. You need to become knowledgeable on, sort of your environmental risks. You need to, sort of start reorienting your activities. You need to start saving resources for, sort of, when disasters happen. You need to start thinking about your neighbors as resources that can be relied on. And one of the remarkable things is that when you actually talk to people who live in these areas, they this is not new to them.
New to them, exactly.
They don't lack this knowledge. They don't lack these resources.
I really liked how you kind of put what is happening into perspective of it being this new form of colonialism, because I feel like the way that you were explaining it, it feels like a weaponization of disaster management or of resources. And I think that also ties into the point that you made in your article about Jamaica, about from the emergency management to managing emergence, that article where you discuss outdated disaster management approaches. And you mentioned that participatory methods are biopolitical in that they allow disaster management to turn everyday activities into places of control and normalization. What parallels, if any, can you draw between Jamaican disaster management and the disaster approaches used in Miami?
I think, the key sort of point or one of the key sort of takeaway points on resilience in Jamaica is that, sort of Jamaica, the territory of Jamaica, the population of Jamaica has always figured a certain way within the broader global political economy as, a possible source of value or a threat to that value and a threat to trade. And so resilience comes along to try and regulate that population in ways that maintain the continued production of value within the global economy. And here, sort of what's important is the way that the economy of Miami has always depended on creating and maintaining racially uneven development. This is something that, it goes against a lot of what we think about when we think about Miami as sort of a modern cosmopolitan, sort of like world city, like in a very sort of like exotic city, sort of at the forefront of everything, a melting pot of multiple ethnicities from around the world, not just sort of Latin America, South America, Central America, but sort of everyone from around the world sort of like comes to Miami.
Yeah.
But this sort of, that's a convenient sort of image that boosters have created and maintained about Miami going back like, sort of over 100 years. But in a nutshell, you can look at the history of Miami and see that, sort of at various points throughout the city's history, it's always been the exploitation of racialized spaces and racialized peoples that has maintained the broader urban economy. And so the city was founded on this very cynical, instrumental use of Black labor. Fast forward a couple decades into the 1920s, 1930s, where there were a series of major hurricanes and flooding events that came through that really threatened, any kind of, sort of long-term viability for the region as a residential area, as a space for agricultural. And what sustained the economy there, what sustained the economy during this time was the way that middle-class landlords were essentially able to utilize segregated spaces in sort of Black Coconut Grove, Overtown, what's sort of these areas where Black, African American, Caribbean laborers had been segregated. These became spaces where people were able to exploit the labor and resources. So landlords, for example, were able to make money hand over foot by forcing people to pay exorbitant rents. They couldn't move to other areas because of segregation, but then the housing was very substandard as well. And so there were no regulation enforcement, and communities, folks who tried to move out were subject to racial violence to reinforce that color line within the city of Miami. And all that created the capital that helped sustain Miami during that period of the 1920s. You can look at it now as well. What are the areas that are targeted for mega development? Everywhere that's targeted for mega development, exactly. Places like Alapata, Wynwood, these are all places where racialized others have been building communities for decades. Little Haiti, Alapata, even parts of Liberty City, Overtown is undergoing this as well now too, where it's these spaces and developers are able to come in and make money on the basis of exploiting Black Miami.
Exactly.
And so this is the system that's been put in place over the last century of Miami's development depends on racially uneven development.
So now I want to pivot a little bit and talk about your role in the Mellon Commons for Justice grant, specifically to the Miami's history of racial violence and segregated urban governance. In chapter 1 of the neighborhood studies, it mentions that throughout the Jim Crow era, like you spoke about, these neighborhoods became the backdrop and the aftermath of racial violence and state abandonment. It also identifies Miami as one of the most segregated cities in the US. And when I read that, I was taken aback a little bit because I was like, I feel like no one really puts Miami into that sort of perspective. No one sees it through that lens. That was said specifically when talking about the spine of distress, which is the terminology that we use to describe the line of low-income minority communities. Specifically, what risks have these communities been exposed to as a result of this, and how do these experiences affect their overall well-being and their social mobility?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that's a crucial question because Miami remains one of the most segregated cities in the country, even decades after sort of Jim Crow. I mean, it's remarkable. You can still see the physical signs of segregation, the segregation wall in Liberty City and Coconut Grove. So not only is Miami physically segregated, but governance in Miami has long been racially exclusionary as well, too. It also speaks to the way that county government has always been an instrument of downtown development interests. And so the provisioning of public services has always been oriented towards serving those downtown development interests. And it's also come with a mindset of like a sort of like winner take all mindset as well, too. John Stack, who's the former dean of the Green School for International Public Affairs, written a couple really nice articles on the history of Miami governance and the way that it instituted particular kinds of racial inequalities. and built those in as almost like a natural functioning of the local governance. And again, there's a long history of this in Jim Crow, where sort of the areas divided by the color line were absent any kind of like safety regulations, hazard regulations, any kind of public services, like even sidewalks and sewers, were not, sort of built out in, sort of segregated sections of Coconut Grove or Overtown, stretching into like the 1920s, 1930s, which is just wild. But like, this is how backwards Miami is,
Exactly.
has been, and this carries on into the future. And so now, currently, like, we have severe disparities in the quality of public services. And one of the interesting things about geographers is we like to think about the way that like we kind of experience space. And Miami is a very interesting space to sort of be a geographer in, because you can begin to think about, where do I actually go when I'm in Miami? Where are my movements? Like, you could pull out a map of Miami and say, where do I actually go? So I don't experience, sort of like North Miami. You don't go to like Liberty City, Opelika, sort of other areas.
Yeah.
Like that. There's certain parts that you just don't go to. And I think, for a lot of people, the city of Miami, our experience of that is very much based around, like, we experience a very particular kind of Miami, but there's multiple Miamis. As Gray Reed, a architect, professor at FIU and a member of the Commons for Justice Network, says, there's many Miamis, there's multiple Miamis. And our experience of the space of Miami is such that we actually very rarely do we ever actually see these other Miamis. But there are real disparities, there are real inequalities. And those inequalities get revealed during disaster events. And so you can look at disaster events and, recent disaster events, or even going back to like sort of Hurricane Andrew, that kind of thing. But there's a saying among folks, sort of within, advocating for like social and environmental and climate justice, that, if something happens south of 88th Street, no one cares about it. Like, you're not going to get help from local government. You're not going to get help from county government, emergency management services.
It's the community.
Exactly. And so, sort of, there's spaces that matter to local government interests, and there's spaces that can be written off. And in these spaces that get written off, this is where you see a lot of community organizing in the aftermath of disasters. So in the wake of, I think it was Hurricane Irma in 2017 that came through, had a lot of impact, sort of throughout South Florida, but, very limited emergency services provided to communities in Homestead, Liberty City. And so you saw some grassroots organizations emerge there. They began working with each other around the Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient Cities program, some of the justice organizations that had really spearheaded the kind of autonomous, self-organized emergency management responses that came about because there was no support from no meaningful support from the local government. And so these are the areas that like continuously have been denied public services. But one of the interesting things about the resilience planning process in Miami was that because, sort of you had the Rockefeller Foundation coming in and shining a big bright light from outside the region onto the way that public services were, that decisions were made on how to allocate public services, you actually saw like the resilience planning process direct a lot of attention to these historically underserved communities. So, it really speaks to something, to the way that, kind of these organizers were able to very, read the landscape strategically and really kind of like utilize interest in resilience to draw attention to these underserved communities and get funds for those communities. But that's not something that's inherent within the resilience process. It's something that those organizers themselves were able to design into the resilience planning structure within the county government.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of the times, just to move back to what you were saying earlier at the start of the podcast, that people get surprised or don't believe that these communities have the capacity to go out and be resilient, and municipal powers and scientific organizations, they're like, oh, this is what you need to do. You need to do X, Y, and Z, when in actuality, it's not doing anything but perpetuating the extraction of value. I think that this is the issue with the top-down approach. It completely disregards this. And I came up with this quote about a year ago called The Duality of Expertise. And it's basically about the fact that expertise is only regarded or respected if it stems from academic or career achievements. And I feel like it's arbitrary, one, and completely overlooks the generational ties and
Mm-hmm.
community resilience and rebuilding efforts that these communities have and how they feel about their desires and their needs. And I feel like in doing this, researchers and city officials take on this savior complex without acknowledging the actual history and
Mm-hmm.
needs of these issues. And I think that the expertise of these community members not being incorporated in the initial design stage of resilience initiatives or environmental methodology, I think that it's extremely problematic because it's not co-designing, it's not co-creating, it's not bringing the community members in at the ground level to be like, hey, what do you need, because you are the expert.
Yeah.
And I think that we have this saying in the grant thematics I read that we can only be just if we pay attention to cries or the perspectives of those who have been facing injustice. And I feel like a lot of the times, especially in South Florida, in these spaces, we are not listening to the cries of these people. And that's something that you do with the neighborhood studies. And that's why I think that it's extremely interesting. So, could you elaborate a little bit more on the necessity of understanding the needs of these marginalized, underrepresented communities in order to work towards promoting justice?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great question. Such a good way to sort of frame it, that these folks are experts. And I think one of the another it made me think of like another way that sort of like the Jim Crow operates today as well, like extends into the present, is that we see all these kind of like participatory task forces created by city and county governments, and they'll create spots for community members, but they'll require certain levels of credentialing. So you have to have a master's degree, you have to have an architect certificate, you have to have an engineer certificate, something like that. There's different forms of credentialing that you have to show. And within these communities, these are communities that have been underfunded in terms of like public resources for the schools. They've been underfunded for decades in terms of economic opportunities, job opportunities. They've been exploited for decades as well. So people living there don't have the ability to get credentials, even though they have just as much, if not more, knowledge. And I would argue that they have far more knowledge on these kinds of issues than technical experts do. So I think, one of the things that we try to do with the Commons for Justice project is to create a space where we were not sort of coming in and saying, like, we know what the problems are in advance. Now we want communities to think about solutions to these problems.
Exactly.
It tends to be, in the best designed technical approaches to resilience, that's like the most that you're going to get. Usually a lot of participation in these kind of resilience projects that come in from the top down, there's this performative element of participation that is big in Miami. And so there's a sense in which, we still, sort of local government in particular will still turn to technical experts to define what resilience is and what kinds of problems resilience should address. And what we wanted to do was to do something completely different, where we said, let's talk to people who have been, sort of on the ground in these communities, sort of for decades, advocating for sort of environmental justice, bringing to light the various forms of social and environmental vulnerabilities that people face within these marginalized communities every day. And let's actually see what kinds of issues they would address. Within the Anthropocene, we sort of see this kind of like, impending like system breakdown, sort of like the world's going to end. This is also horrible and awful. We need to address this. Indigenous communities, Black communities have been living with and dealing with the end of the world for centuries. And so when it comes to thinking about, kind of like what are the issues and threats that resilience can and should address, you get a very different picture about that when you talk to people who've been on the ground working within these communities nowadays, as they struggle with kind of everyday toxic environments, where it's not just about, kind of like environmental pollution or maybe future flooding, like that does matter. But a toxic environment also means, sort of like, folks in like Liberty City and Overtown who are living on areas where, sort of toxic landfill sites and industrial waste create high levels of cancer incidence within community members and their children, and that's seen as part of like, daily life that these people have to deal with.
And that also goes back to your point about how we stay in this little bubble of Miami. A lot of people would not know that that is the reality that somebody a few miles away is facing.
Oh, exactly. Right. And there's so much, and it's awful because, this is something where, we tend to identify those problems as being out there. Like this is like sort of the general, like, sort of American imaginary is that, America great, like problems elsewhere. You just look in, throughout our cities, and even throughout like rural countrysides, like Cancer Alley, in the Mississippi Gulf region, is a similar area where, some of the most polluted air, polluted water, polluted land in the world is in these areas. And, the same thing can be said for Miami. You don't have to look far in Miami to find areas where, there's incredibly high, just like cancer clusters because of the legacies, the historical legacies of racial segregation, and the destruction of land within these racialized communities. And so, what does resilience look like if you're trying to deal with, sort of like these legacies of, environmental harm? What does this resilience look like if you're dealing with a toxic environment that comes from, sort of the anxieties of not being able to make rent or afford food or access sort of fresh food options?
Exactly.
Even though, you work multiple jobs, but you're still not able to afford this because of various sort of laws, because the laws benefit the landlords and the employers rather than the workers and the renters. And also too, to think about the histories in these communities. So we can look at places like West Grove, Alapata, like this, with long histories of that. We can also look at places like Overtown and Liberty City, where people continue to create community, even though they're targeted by racialized, uneven development practices, extraction of value, racialized disinvestment. But there's histories of the way that people have defended and created their communities as spaces where, they're able to live both within and beyond sort of the the everyday practices and norms of a highly racialized society like Miami.
That's something that I really wanted to touch on before we close up is I think it's incredibly interesting that political geography can serve as this valuable tool in gaining insight into the multifaceted ways that these communities have reacted to and adapted to the historical context of racialized governance and heightened risk. And I feel like also something that the grant talks about is that the inequalities present within pre-disaster risk reduction and post-event resilience and disaster management is often ignored and conveniently forgotten. And that's something that we were speaking about. But I'd like to pivot now to talk about the actual community resilience and what these people are doing. How does this transforming of resilience inform or guide designs of policies, interventions, initiatives to cater to the unique aspirations of these communities?
Yeah. And I think that's a great question, because I think what it draws out and what it draws attention to is the way that, we have to situate, sort of current demands for resilience in this much larger history of racialized development and resistance to racially uneven development. And I think this is where the question of like, how can we rethink what resilience means really comes into play? Because if resilience, we need to think about resilience as more than sort of building capacities to stand threats to future urban systemic disruptions. We need to think about resilience as both future-oriented and as engaging with historical legacies of racially uneven development and resistance to racially uneven development. I think one of the key things, there's a couple key things, you see a lot of interest in sort of mutual aid, and these mutual aid networks become quite relevant in post-disaster contexts as well, too, as they're able to provide essential services that, sort of local emergency management doesn't provide because it's not in the valued spaces, the valued communities. So those mutual aid networks are important, sort of thinking about the ways that, sort of research can support, the long-term institutionalization of these networks is quite important, because oftentimes these mutual aid networks are ad hoc. They'll arise in the wake of a disaster, and then, sort of as recovery happens, as a sense of normalcy returns, then those organizations kind of wither away, and then, later another disaster happens and they have to
It's a cycle.
So how can you actually give a little bit of institutional longevity to that? And then another real, and I think this was something that was kind of surprising as well too, although it shouldn't be, if we know sort of our history of sort of Black resistance to white supremacy, but also, kind of like the role of history and the role of creating and sharing history within communities and across generations within communities is quite essential. If you know the history of your community, you know the way that people have organized against and fought against and defended the community against those kinds of, extractive practices, different forms of racial violence, then you're that much more prepared to continue creating and defending your community against all forms of social and environmental disruptions. And so, there's a lot of expertise, there's a lot of knowledge within these communities on how to survive and how to thrive and how to build community and how to defend place. And so it becomes a matter of how can we support that kind of those kinds of history creating and history sharing practices.
Exactly.
So I think that's really what we've been trying to kind of talk through and sort of recognize what kinds of activities our partners are already engaged in and how we can support and enhance those, because you're not going to arrive at model of resilience that advances common justice goals if we're not thinking about and addressing the kinds of insecurities, vulnerabilities, threats, and also building the capacities of these communities that we're in, that we're working with.
Exactly. And I feel like that's something that, because I actually work on the history exchange component of the grant, and that's something that we keep in mind is one community has a history with a certain threat, whereas another community may not have the same experience. I mean, them sharing their histories and how they've been resilient towards these threats or how they haven't. I mean, that's so important because I think that oftentimes, like you said, if we don't go to certain areas, if we don't go out of our way to get to certain areas in Miami, we will never go there. And I think it's really important to share these histories so that people can understand that this is happening and so that they aren't conveniently forgotten. So thank you for taking the time to come on and speak with us about community resilience and your work with the grant. So before I let you go, I just want to ask you really quickly, what are your hopes for the future in terms of community resilience and community capacity for these communities? How do you feel about the future?
I think, we have to have hope, right? Because I think that hope has to be sort of grounded in, sort of a strategic analysis of what factors are actually facing us down. And I think, if we think about the future only in terms of environmental threats, then, sort of we're blinding ourselves to issues and to resources that are out there and that folks have been engaging in, sort of a variety of different forms of practice, sort of to create more just and sustainable futures. And I think this is really where it kind of like comes into play, right? Is how can we sort of support, the dreams and the aspirations for self-determination among peoples who have been systematically denied the possibility of self-determination.
Yeah.
And I think, as long as we keep that in mind, then we have reason for hope and we have reason for organizing.
Thank you. That was really good. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on and speak to us.
As we wrap up this episode, I want to give you a challenge. Take a moment to explore the intricacies of your communities. Venture into the places we often overlook and discover what sets them apart. How can we make a meaningful difference if we're not genuinely acquainted with what we're striving to transform? Let this be an invitation to step outside your comfort zone and witness the diverse tapestry that makes up the world around you. While our conversation lingers in your thoughts, ask yourself, what are your hopes for the future, and how can you challenge yourself to become an advocate for change? Until next time, continue exploring, questioning, and advocating for a world where justice is the common thread weaving us all together. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Commons for Justice podcast.